Hey guys, and welcome back to another Axel 72 video, and in today's video I'm going to be giving my prediction for the Chris Eubank Jr. versus Conor Benn fight. And so if you are new around here and you haven't yet subscribed, please do so, like the video if you do indeed like the video, and let's get straight into this. So this is arguably the biggest British fight of the year, to be completely honest. I mean, there was the big highlights of AJ versus Dubois last year, as well as, of course, the two Fury Usyk fights, but they, of course, weren't in England. And so, other than that, I mean, it's seemingly kind of been the case that the UK's been lacking some big boxing events as of recent. And, like Eddie Hearn's kind of touched upon, we kind of have to go back to like a Froch Groves to be able to kind of get the same level of excitement and hype and just fans willing to watch for a fight that's not a heavyweight fight in the British kind of scene. And it's sad to see, realistically, because British boxing is amazing. It's just not got the kind of level of rivalries in which perhaps it does in the American side. It's not got the same kind of hype and build up as perhaps it should do. And, a fight like this is a huge fight, and it's getting the respect from everybody across the globe, and it's got all the eyes on it, and it's got the clear history between the two of them. It's got the hatred between the two of them. It's got the whole story, of course, with it being what was meant to happen before, and then it got now rescheduled. And so in general, it is excellent, in my opinion, to see that this fight is happening. Excuse the pun, me saying excellent. But, like I say, there was definitely a time in which we didn't think that this fight was going to happen because, of course, Conor Benn tested for all these drugs, I suppose, and tested positive for all these different things, and everybody was slandering him. And we still, we've been told about how it's been cleared and everything like that, but we haven't actually been given any clear evidence, realistically, of kind of foolproof. Just the fact that he didn't cheat, or he didn't find anything in his system. And to be fair, even in the build up to this fight, there hasn't really been that many questions around it, to be completely honest. I don't feel like many people have really, other than, of course, the incident with Chris Eubank slapping him with an egg, there's not really been too much talk in the way of actually hard questioning him, because every time he's kind of mentioned has he had it in his system, he's just kind of said that he's been cleared. So that doesn't necessarily say that he didn't have it in his system, and that doesn't necessarily clear up that he doesn't have it in his system on purpose. It's just saying that he's been cleared, which is a fact, but it's just interesting to see that, like I say, he is kind of maybe not avoiding the question, but just giving an answer which doesn't answer all the questions. And so we now see this fight. Of course, there has been things in the past with kind of Eubank floating around with possible things that he's maybe done and stuff like that. It's never kind of been smooth sailing for both of these fighters. But like I say, we're kind of brushing that all aside for this contest, and we have this fight now. And I mean, I'm very excited for it, no matter what. There's been loads of fighters in the past who have tested positive for these kind of things. I'm glad that it's at least now, whatever it was is now out of his system, but it's inexcusable, and he should have been banned if it was in his system on purpose. But like I say, it's happened to loads of fighters in the past, so at least we've kind of now moved on, I suppose. And he's not suffered a ban because he's been fighting, but he's not been able to fight on the same kind of level in which I'm sure he's been wanting to. But for himself, he's, like I say, had a few fights in between the kind of incident and the first fights being arranged. He had a fight at super welterweight and a fight at welterweight last time against Peter Dobson. That was an interesting contest where he did look good and he did look ferocious and explosive, as he always does, but like the Orozco fight in which he fought at super welterweight, his power didn't look quite the same. It still looked like all of his punches were landing with intent and they were landing and being thrown to hurt, but it didn't necessarily look like they were really, doing tremendous amounts of damage to Peter Dobson. Maybe that's just credit to Dobson's chin and the fact that, he maybe hasn't been tested his chin and it still was holding up quite well. It's not a chin that's been tested and is fragile and stuff like that. But for somebody like a Chris Eubank, his chin more recently has been tested, and yes, you could argue the whole kind of thing with Liam-Smith in the first fight, the possible, well, the elbows kind of thrown and things like that, which dropped him and stuff like that. But he did look wobbly, he did look hurt, there was a few punches that snuck through there. And so you can argue that if somebody like a Liam-Smith is able to do damage to Chris Eubank Jr., then possibly somebody like a Conor Benn, who is much more ferocious and, is also bringing Chris Eubank Jr. down in weight to fight him, could definitely cause some damage. And so it will be interesting to see how good's Chris Eubank's chin, and also the fact of him coming down in weight. Of course, Senior doesn't approve of this fight. I don't think he agrees at all with the whole kind of weight situation, and he does have a valid point. The whole rehydration clause and forcing him to come down at weight and stay at that weight, especially in the first time that they were meant to fight, the amount of weights that Chris Eubank cut was arguably dangerous levels. It didn't look safe, and the fact he probably would have, well, I think it was a rehydration clause in the first fight as well. Like I say, it wasn't safe and it wasn't nice to see. It perhaps might be a little bit better for this fight because he's maybe been able to maintain the weight a little bit better, but it's still not the greatest, and I don't blame Chris Eubank Sr. for not really wanting to get involved with this fight because, there is the whole thing about the family bloodline, history, legacy in this fight, but also at the same time, Chris Eubank Sr. has had a lot of, bad things happen to him in boxing. He's caused some serious damage to his opponents and, not in a kind of nice way, like long-term damage, which is just not really, you want to be able to put on a show in the moment and maybe cause some pain and harm to them in the moment. But for the most part, you don't want to be causing serious kind of life-changing damage. And he's done that to a few opponents, not on purpose, but it's just happened. And also at the same time, he's had a son that was in boxing and, passed and things like that. So I don't blame him for not realistically wanting to get involved in this fight, but it does mean that the kind of, like I say, the bloodline history thing isn't perhaps there. Does that mean that Chris Eubank Jr. is going to be coming into this fight with any different type of mentality? No, because he's used to not fighting with his dad in his corner now, and he's got, I believe, Bomac still in his corner, and it seemed like in his last fight versus Liam-Smith, with Bomac, it looked like he was fighting well excellently. That was with Bomac, and then he had the fight versus Serramenta as well, and so he did look very good in that fight. So if he still does have Bomac in his corner, which I believe he does, then I think he can have success and he can look good. I think against Serrameta, I think against Liam-Smith, he was fighting some of the best fights we've seen from him, at least, in his career, perhaps. Obviously, Liam-Smith in that fight didn't look amazing. He did look a little bit, not shot, but he didn't look brilliant. And he did look like he was perhaps struggling a little bit to get going behind anything. He looked a bit weak and a bit fragile. And normally, when you see a fighter look like that, it's difficult for a fighter to be able to change that round. And, Chris Eubank Jr. avenged that knockout defeat and looked very good in the process in that. And then against Serrameta, he was looking a bit more aggressive. Yes, he maybe got caught a little bit at times with shots because he was being more aggressive, but he did what he had to do against an opponent in which he needed to make a statement against, and he looked good. He knocked him down on multiple occasions and inevitably, got the knockout. I don't think he's as powerful as a puncher as what Conor Benn can be, and I don't think he does throw as ferociously. Perhaps he is, the more technical and the smarter, and I like the angles in which he works, but there is still, there is the comparisons between the two of them. There is the similarities between the two of them and their parents, but at the same time, I just don't think that Chris Eubank Jr. is at the same level as Chris Eubank Sr. I don't think, of course, Conor Benn, he perhaps could get to the same level as Nigel Benn, but like I said, I'm not entirely sure if he can get there just yet. So, I wouldn't look too much deep into that actual bloodline of it, in my opinion. For who I think is going to win, I'm going to say that Conor Benn's going to win via KO in round 4. Yes, that is a big statement to be made, and yes, it's a bold prediction from myself, but I think that Conor Benn can, like I say, he's bringing Eubank Jr. down in weight. He's gonna be looking ferocious. He's gonna be really kind of excited to just go out there and to let his hands go. I think he might start trying to box, but I just think even if he does try and start boxing, which I don't think he should do at a mid-range, because I think Chris Eubank Jr. could easily catch him with an uppercut or, something like that. As soon as Conor Benn gets caught with a shot, I think he will start coming in and start trying to be ferocious. Perhaps Chris Eubank Jr. might be able to use his movement and make him maybe look a little bit silly at times and, have a few good moments like that. But I think the more he does that, the more he frustrates Conor Benn. And I think typically fighting ferociously and fighting off anger isn't necessarily a good thing, but I think he's so fueled up for this fight that I genuinely believe the hype and that kind of aggressiveness behind him, that I think the more frustrated he is, the better he could be, unless Chris Eubank Jr.'s movement is excellent throughout the entire fight, which I don't think it will be. I think there will be times in which Chris Eubank Jr. might even get dragged into a war, and if that does happen, then I think Conor Benn is going to be able to have success and, like I say, stop him early. I think it could be a very exciting third and fourth round. It could be, back and forth between the two of them, but inevitably I think Conor Benn will have more in him to be able to hurt Chris Eubank Jr. and, like I say, go on to stop him. If it does go later on into the fight, like I say, he could get more and more frustrated, and that's when, problems might occur and things like that. We might see Eubank Jr. being able to utilize his movement and his jab a bit better, and his uppercut, which, like I say, is a very nice uppercut, and maybe might be able to tie up Conor Benn when he tries to get in close. But I just don't necessarily see that it will go past these kind of earlier rounds. And like I say, I have a Benn KO in round 4. Then who he goes on to fight next? I mean, I'm pretty sure there is a rematch clause just guaranteed for this fight. And realistically, even if Chris Eubank Jr. gets knocked out in the very first punch of round 1, I think he's destined to take the rematch, because realistically, there's not really much more else in his career. I think it's such a defining moment in both of their careers that, if one fighter is to lose twice badly via knockout, then that probably is the end of their career. Or at least, for Chris Eubank Jr., that might be the end of his career. And so, I do think, of course, looking at the Billiam-Smith kind of whole, how he came back from being knocked out early, he will take the rematch, even if he does get stopped early. But we'll have to wait and see if he can make the adjustments, and of course see how this first fight plays out before I can give any sort of prediction for a rematch. Going on to speak about the other fights on the card, like I say, it's an excellent card, showcasing some great British talent, and that's what I want to be seeing. Like I say, there's some excellent fighters in the UK and some excellent fights. I'm just a bit sad to see that the actual undercard hasn't really been hyped up or talked about too much or really promoted that well. I feel like these all have kind of capabilities to be main event type fights, but like I said, they just haven't been promoted or pushed anywhere near as much as what they could have done and, would have done if they were main event fights. So it's a little bit of a shame, but of course we have Lyndon versus Anthony Yarde, the trilogy fight. This is a bit of a strange contest to see that it's been made into a trilogy. Was anybody realistically wanting to see a third fight? No, but on paper, does it kind of make sense? Yes. It's strange because obviously we had the first two fights. We had Lyndon win by split decision. That was a bit of a controversial one. Made sense that we'd see the rematch, which of course Anthony Yarde ended up winning via stoppage in, I believe it was round 4, and that was a convincing stoppage. And perhaps it wasn't a brutal type of knockout, but it was still a knockout nonetheless, and it was still one of the bigger wins in Anthony Yarde's career at that time. And so, now we have moved on a bit and there's been progression with both fighters. I mean, Lyndon his last two fights, we've seen him fight Dmitry Bivol. We've seen him fight him on the card of the, I can't remember what card it was actually, but it was one of the Riyadh season shows, and that was impressive to see that he was able to go all the rounds. And I think it's shown him credit. He did get outboxed completely and he did get hurt at times, and he didn't look amazing and he didn't look like he was anywhere near the level of Bivol, but he did manage to last the entire fight. And like I say, you've got to give him credit for doing that, and he stepped up, and that was a big moment for him. Then he went on to fight Liam Cameron, which of course, just this weekend we've seen Liam Cameron lose via stoppage, but at that time, he was still a bit of a, not an unknown, because obviously he had his whole career before having a few years out, but we haven't really seen him at a high level since he'd been with a few years out, and so we weren't really too sure what to expect from Liam Cameron, and he looked good. And Lyndon only won via split decision, and I think it was a very close fight, and so there was definitely possibilities that I would have liked to have seen a rematch between the two of them. Obviously, now we've seen Liam Cameron just lose via stoppage. We're probably not going to see Liam Cameron fight something like a Lyndon anytime soon. So, perhaps not the most impressive of runs, but not a bad run either. Like I say, going all around with the now one of the pound for pound best fighters in the world, and then beating somebody in a scrappy fight, which was always going to be a scrappy fight, isn't that bad. But somebody like an Anthony Yarde, his last few fights, he had the moment versus Artur Beterbiev, similarly to that of Lyndon Arthur, where his stock did rise because, he did get stopped inevitably in round 8, but he survived a big onslaught. He tried to push the tempo a bit at times. He really gave it his all, and you got to give him credit for what he did in that night. And, there was a lot of expectations for him to just get knocked out really badly and to him get really hurt. And he didn't, he did last out, like I said, to the 8th round with one of the best, again, one of the best pound for pound fighters, one of the most ferocious, aggressive at that time, especially, knocking and stopping everybody. He he did well in that fight, but then he had a few takeover fights. He won a couple via knockout, and then his last one was on a Sky card, which was a bit of an interesting one. It wasn't the best of performances. He didn't look amazing. He knocked down his opponent with the first punch, but then other than that, he didn't really follow up on his work. He looked lackluster. He looked like he perhaps wasn't really that bothered. But it's been a bit of an interesting point in his career because obviously he was with Queensberry. Then there was a whole kind of contract dispute between the two of them. Then he managed to make himself a free agent. Then from being a free agent, he seemingly has joined on with Boxer, but then hasn't really done too much good since joining on with them. So was that really a good move or a bad move? I'm not entirely sure. And now we're seeing the third fight between him and Lyndon Arthur, which, like I say, since being with Boxer has not really propelled his career in the right direction after, coming off the big bounce of headlining against Beterbiev. It's just been maybe not the best to see his career and the progression in which it's made as of recent, but I still think that Yarde's going to be able to win. I think he's going to be able to win via unanimous decision. I think he is still the better fighter out of the two of them. I don't think he's putting as much into his punches or throwing as with as much intent at the moment, but I still think he can swarm over Lyndon Arthur, and Lyndon Arthur was kind of wobbling quite a lot at the time when he was facing Liam Cameron, when Liam Cameron was in his face, and if Anthony Yarde backs him up, Lyndon Arthur could get his jab going. I like how he, flings up that jab. Yes, he keeps his hand low, but it is quite a difficult jab to be able to see and to be able to deal with when he throws it, and he follows that up with a similar kind of straight, but I think other than that, Yarde can definitely outbox him. Like I say, go to the body, use the inside, get inside, work well, get him on the ropes. Lyndon Arthur, I think, like I say, will just willingly go onto the ropes. And like I say, inevitably, I think Yarde will be able to wear him down and win via unanimous decision. And then who he could go on to fight next, I think it's an interesting one. I think he's not going to go on to fight something like a Beterbiev or a Bivol or even a Callum Smith, because Callum Smith seems like he's going to be fighting Benavidez possibly for the vacant WBC title. Well, it might not be vacant now because I think Benavidez got elevated, but perhaps for that title. So maybe something like the winner of the Morel versus Hataya fight could be a good fight. It seems like Morel was being favoured by His Excellency, so like I say, that could be an interesting fight. Boatsi could be a good fight. There's been a lot of history behind that kind of fight. They've seemingly talked about that fight quite a lot, and that's always been a British fight in which would be entertaining, and I'd be up for seeing that. Or a Zach Parker, perhaps that fight could happen. He was meant to fight Willie Hutchinson, again another opponent there, a British type of opponent. All good fights, but I just don't think he'll be breaching into the world kind of level. Just at the moment, it is difficult because of just the fact that Bivol, Beterbiev and Benavidez are taking up them top slots, as well as even Callum Smith, who's just kind of creeping in there with the top of the light heavyweight scene. So now we move on to speak about another fight on the card. We go to Chris Billiam-Smith versus Brandon Glanton. This is quite a good fight, I think, in my opinion. I think it's a fight in which is going to have two styles which are going to gel. Chris Billiam-Smith is coming off the loss to Zerda Ramirez, and before that he was on a good run. He was looking, good. He was headlining events for Boxer, and he beat Riakporhe in a scrappy fight, which wasn't the best of fights. And again, he beat Okoli in a scrappy fight, which wasn't the best of fights to watch on paper. But then he went, he had a bit of a lackluster fight versus Masternak, and then he went on to fight Zerda Ramirez, which was a big step up, which I think was definitely necessary at the time, because I felt like he was just kind of wasting his career a little bit if he was just going to be fighting people like a Masternak and things like that. I feel like he needed a big kind of payday moment where he was showcased to the rest of the world to see how good he actually was. And, he did get, beaten up to an extent against Ramirez. He held his own and was impressive to be able to make it all the rounds and to be able to, survive and to be able to take shots in which he did. But by the end, he looked knackered. He was fighting purely off just heart, which you got to respect. He's always had that heart. When you look back at like an Isaac Chamberlain fight for him, he fought with so much heart in that fight as well, and so he always has got that. But it just wasn't enough, and you could see the skill level, and you could see him getting very tired. But yeah, the skill level of Zerda Ramirez was just much more superior, and his movement was much better, and Chris Billiam-Smith's kind of agility was really shown as well. The fact that he couldn't really move around with Zerda Ramirez the same way in which he was. But then now he faces somebody against Brandon Glanton, which you're not really going to have to worry about the movement because he's not really as, he's not a big agile type of guy. He is going to stand in front of you and he is just going to bang. He has got power. He has arguably got more power than that of Chris Billiam-Smith, but he's also had losses in his career as well. He had back-to-back defeats. He had one versus David Light, as a name in which you might know. Of course, David Light went on to fight Lawrence Okoli and lost via unanimous decision in a fight which wasn't really the best of fights either, but he beat Brandon Glanton. Glanton's on a bit of a good run, not beating anybody too crazy, and is really wanting to, make a bit of a statement victory. Got himself in a good world ranked position, but I don't think the cruiserweight world rankings are really anything too crazy at the moment. But like I say, Glanton is going to be in your face. He's going to be punching hard. He's going to be trying to weigh you down. He even knocked down David Light in the last round. And so I do think Glanton's going to be able to win via unanimous decision. Yes, I might be boring saying these unanimous decisions, but I think that Glanton can really wear down, like I say, Billiam-Smith. And Billiam-Smith perhaps might not be the same type of fighter to an extent after the Zerda Ramirez fight. I don't think he would have, you know, he might not be able to go all the rounds the same and things like that. I mean, I think he will still have a good chin, which is why I think he'll be able to survive, but he might get knocked down in this fight. I think Glanton will be able to push him back, and Billiam-Smith will probably go on the back foot and accept the back foot. Billiam-Smith might have the faster hand at times, especially early on in the fight, but I think inevitably Glanton will be able to go to the body, switch it up to the head, just throw that bit more aggressive, more footing shots, which will cause more damage. And like I say, he can continue to do that into the later rounds, like he did versus David Light, even though he was losing. The thing that he was getting caught with against David Light was the uppercut for the most part, and I don't think Chris Billiam-Smith really throws the best variation of shots. He, like I say, might throw more shots in kind of combination punching, but I just don't think it will be thrown with as much intent. And like I say, he does drop his guard and he does look tired later on into the fight, as he has now shown. And like I say, he's not coming off the two best of performances realistically. And like I say, I think this is a fight for Glanton to be able to win when he's in Chris Billiam-Smith's home country. Then who he could go on to fight next? I mean, I think there is a clear path for him to go on to fight the winner of Jack versus McKenna. If not, Rosicky was meant to fight Jack, so if that fight happens instead, then perhaps somebody like a Peralta, who caused a lot of issues to Rosicky, and, I think Drew versus Rosicky and beat Rosicky, so that could be a good fight. Sin Cara was meant to fight Opataya. He's got himself in a good position, a German fighter, and of course he's not fighting Opataya now. Sakio's fighting Opataya, so that could be a good fight. Or Briedis, I think that would be an excellent fight. I would love to see Briedis back, because even though he is on getting on the older side and things like that, he still looked against Opataya in their rematch that he still had a lot left to give, and he still can be in entertaining fights. But I just feel like perhaps if Riyadh Season and His Excellency want to see Briedis back and Glanton back, that could be an excellent matchup to be made there as well. But now we move on to Liam-Smith versus Aaron McKenna. This is perhaps a bit of a coming of age type fight, and maybe an older versus younger generation type fight between the two of them here. Liam-Smith, of course, like I say, weltered under the kind of fights when he was fighting Chris Eubank Jr., and he did look quite weak. But before that, he was coming off a good fight versus Chris Eubank Jr. in the first fight, and he knocked him out. And Liam-Smith's had some good moments. He, I believe, is a former world champion. He didn't really beat the highest level of opposition. He got beat by Canelo, and he's had a few definitely more noticeable names than that of somebody like an Aaron McKenna. But Aaron McKenna is looking good. I'm liking what I'm seeing from him. He did do a good job against Estella, put it on him, was throwing nice variations of punches and was looking good on the inside, and Estella was an unbeaten fighter. It was sad to see that the Matchroom prize fighter Japan tournament didn't carry on, because I was invested in that, and it just seemed to not get the same kind of viewing figures, which kind of made sense, because out in Japan I just didn't think it would get that good a level of viewers watching, especially in the UK and things like that. And I felt like that was kind of the problem. But Aaron McKenna has kind of waited around for a big opportunity since then, and this is definitely a good fight. Of course, Liam-Smith, he's he was meant to fight Kelly, but then that fight didn't happen because I believe Liam-Smith had an injury. So I just don't think Liam-Smith coming into this fight is in the best kind of possible shape in which he could be in. Of course, he's re-signed back with Matchroom, so that's a big thing. And of course, his brother's now going on to do big things and good things, which was, perhaps a little bit unexpected. But I just don't think he's, at the same level. Like I say, it takes a lot for a fighter to be able to look weak in a fight and look like they're struggling to keep up with his tempo and then be able to switch it in the next fight. And obviously he hasn't fought since 2023. He might be able to kind of hash away the demons and recover back, but I just think McKenna's going to be able to win, and I think he's going to be able to stop him via TKO in round 6. I think he's going to be able to have the much more so success. I think he's going to be able to push him back. I think Liam-Smith might look weak again and might not be able to keep up with the tempo of somebody like a McKenna who does throw a lot and is accurate. He's also not stupid when he's throwing as well. He's technically smart when he's throwing as well, and I think he has a lot of potential, McKenna, and he's an underrated type of fighter, and he definitely should be given more opportunities, and hopefully will after this fight. And so yeah, like I say, McKenna, I think he's going to be able to win via stoppage in round 6. And the final fight in which I'm going to be talking about on this card, going through the whole card for this card because I think it is an excellent card. I'm saying card a lot, but this is Viddal Riley versus Chev Clarke for the British Cruiserweight title. This is an excellent fight. I think it's a fight in which definitely should be promoted more. It isn't. I respect Viddal Riley for going down this actual boxing route where he wants to prove himself as a world level kind of boxer, not just a YouTube type of boxer. So he's in with a tough fight here against Chev Clarke. Of course, Chev Clarke was perhaps a little bit unfortunate to lose against Mosquera for the European title when he did at the end of last year, but he did, carry on and survive well when he got knocked down in the early rounds. He survived well and carried on coming forwards, kept bringing the pressure, kept looking good until the very final bell. And, perhaps you would have thought maybe he could have just nicked it on the cards, but of course he didn't. Comparing that to Viddal Riley, who has been on an excellent run. He's got this big back, and he was meant to be fighting Isaac Chamberlain, which was still a very good fight, but I think he would have been able to beat Isaac Chamberlain. Of course, Chamberlain pulled out the fight, and that fight didn't happen again. I believe it didn't happen twice, or at least, he pulled out once, and then they just kind of moved on and put him in with this fight, which should be happening more often. If a fighter keeps pulling out or isn't willing to fight this opponent or is, taking too long, it should just get moved on because you're just wasting and holding up the division. So it's nice to see that they're, cross promoting, again as well with this fight. And I think it is going to be a good fight. I think it's going to be two styles that gel. I think they're going to be willing to just throw down upon each other. I think Riley's going to be able to win via KO in round 4. It might be a very big statement for him to be able to do so, but I think Chev Clarke has shown that he can be hurt now, and I think if Viddal Riley hurts him, he's going to put on a bit more smarter pressure. I would like to see him not headhunting as much as what he did in his last fight to Riley, but I think he was only doing that because he was in against a heavyweight opponent, and so now he's come back down to cruiserweight. Hopefully his power and things like that will still be there. And perhaps if it goes later on into the fight, he might switch off a little bit, and that's when Chev Clarke might be able to have success. But I think Riley's going to be able to stop him and hurt him and make a statement victory, which will really propel him up in the cruiserweight rankings. And then who he could go on to fight next, somebody like a Mosquera, of course, European champion, or not Mosquera, who of course beat Chev Clarke. That could be a good fight to move him on to European level, and that could main event on a Boxer show. Or somebody like a Jack Massey. Jack Massey, of course, fought top attire and got beaten up, but before that he beat Chamberlain and looked good in that fight, and he's definitely had some good moments. Of course, he had a great fight versus Parker as well, so there is some good, very good fights there to be made. Of course, Ngannou as well could be a good fight. IBO champion, that will put him, if he wins that, right into world title contention and have an IBO world title. So there is, like I say, some excellent fights there to be made if he does win via statement victory. But yeah, that is it for today's video. Hope you did enjoy it. Like the video if you did, like the video, subscribe if you're new, and thanks for watching.